The Wyoming wind carries whispers of fortunes won and lives lost, but on this evening it carried the scent of something more primal blood. For Ilara Hayes, a woman carving a life from the unforgiving dust, the crimson droplets staining the ochre earth were a death sentence. Not her own, but one she could choose to ignore. Following that trail meant inviting a war into her home. Turning away meant surrendering her soul to the silence. What would you do when faced with a choice that could condemn a man to death or plunge an entire territory into a firestorm of violence? Her story isn't just a tale of the West. It's a testament to the fact that the most monumental moments in history often hinge on a single heart-pounding decision made between one sunset and the next. The sun bled out across the western horizon, painting the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. It was a spectacle of brutal beauty, one that Ilara Hayes usually found solace in. Tonight, however, the colors felt like a premonition. A chill born not of the descending night, but of a deep-seated dread snaked up her spine. Her homestead, a solitary point of defiant life, nestled in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Wyoming Territory, felt smaller than ever, a ship of weathered timber, adrift on a sea of rustling prairie grass. For a year since Samuel's passing, this solitude had been her shield. The rhythmic work of the ranch mending fences, tending to the small herd of cattle, drawing water from the well, was a litany that kept grief at bay. The silence was her companion, broken only by the lowing of her stock or the cry of a distant hawk. But the silence of this particular evening was different. It was a held breath. The air itself seemed coiled, waiting. It was a flicker of unnatural color near the cottonwoods bordering Whispering Creek that first drew her eye. Not the deep red of the setting sun, but a brighter, wetter scarlet. She paused, her hand resting on the worn stock of the Winchester rifle that was always within arm's reach. Her heart, a steady drum against her ribs, picked up its tempo. Animals bled. A coyote might have taken a rabbit, or a mountain lion a stray calf. But this was different. The trail was distinct, a deliberate path of drips and smears leading away from the creek and into the growing shadows of the rock-strewn foothills. It was human. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to bolt the cabin door, and pretend she had seen nothing. The territory was a tinderbox. Tensions between the settlers, the railroad men, and the Cheyenne and Lakota tribes were simmering, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. Colonel Gideon Blackwood, the ambitious commander at Fort Laramie, made no secret of his belief that the only path to progress was through forceful subjugation. A single drop of the wrong blood, shed in the wrong place, could be the spark. Yet she couldn't turn away. Samuel had taught her many things, but the most indelible lesson was that you don't leave a soul to the wolves, be they four-legged or two. He had been a man who believed in a quiet, unyielding code of conduct, a code now buried with him on the small rise behind the cabin. Ignoring this trail felt like a betrayal of that memory, a second burial. With the Winchester held low and ready, she followed the trail. The sun dipped below the mountains, and the world was plunged into a twilight of deep blues and inky blacks. The blood was harder to see now, dark smudges on the darkening earth. She relied on instinct, on the subtler signs, a bent blade of grass, a scuffed rock, the faint, coppery scent on the air. The trail led her into a shallow, rocky arroyo, a jagged scar in the land, and there, slumped against a sheer rock face, was the source. He was a Cheyenne warrior. His build was lean and powerful, even in collapse. A wealth of dark hair, unbound, fell across his shoulders. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple breechcloth, his chest and arms bare, revealing a tapestry of old scars and fresh wounds. A deep gash ran along his ribs, sluggishly seeping blood, and his left shoulder was a mess of torn flesh, likely from a rifle ball. But it was his face that held her captive. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that, even clouded with pain, held a fierce, unquenchable fire. He was conscious barely. In his hand, he clutched a leather pouch, his knuckles white with the strain of his grip. He saw her, and his eyes narrowed. His hand moved weakly toward a knife sheathed at his belt. There was no fear in his expression, only a defiant exhaustion, a warrior's readiness to meet his end. Ilara's breath hitched. This was no mere hunting accident. The nature of his wounds spoke of an ambush of a desperate fight. He was a spark, a walking, breathing catalyst for the very war she feared. To help him was to pull that war to her doorstep. The soldiers from the fort, led by men who saw all natives as savages, would not be merciful. They would burn her cabin salt, her earth, and worse. To leave him was the only sane choice. He would be dead by morning, the coyotes would do their work, and the prairie would keep its secrets. No one would ever know. She stood there, a lone woman, silhouetted against the last vestiges of twilight, the cold metal of her rifle, a stark contrast to the warmth of the man's fading lifeblood staining the ground. The wind whispered through the arroyo, carrying the scent of sagebrush and blood. It was the whisper of a choice between the safety of her solitary world and the terrifying unknown consequences of a single act of compassion. At sunset, she had found his trail. What she did before sunrise would determine more than just one man's fate. Her choice was not just about him. It was about the woman Samuel had believed her to be. With a resolve that felt both terrifying and utterly right, she lowered the rifle. She took a slow step forward, holding her empty hands out, palms up in a gesture she hoped he would understand. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still air. "Let me help." His gaze didn't waver, but the tension in his hand, the one reaching for the knife, seemed to lessen almost imperceptibly. In that small gesture, in that fragile moment of shared humanity, in the desolate heart of a hostile land, a pact was silently forged. Ilara Hayes had made her choice. She just didn't yet know the price it would demand. The man was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Getting him back to the cabin was a trial of strength and will Ilara hadn't endured since hauling Samuel from beneath a collapsed wagon. She half dragged, half carried him, his labored breathing a harsh rhythm in the deepening night. Every rustle in the grass, every hoot of a distant owl sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She was a woman smuggling a lit fuse into a powder magazine, and the magazine was her own home. Inside, the warm, familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs was a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood that now filled the single room. She laid him gently on the braided rug before the hearth, the firelight dancing across the sharp angles of his face and the grim reality of his wounds. For a moment, she was overwhelmed. She was a rancher, not a doctor. She knew how to set a calf's broken leg and stitch a tear in a horse's hide, but this was different. Pushing the fear down, she fell back on pragmatism. First water. She fetched a basin and clean cloths, her movement swift and efficient. As she began to clean the gash on his ribs, he flinched, his body tensing. His eyes, dark and piercing, followed her every move. "I have to clean it," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "It will fester otherwise." He didn't understand her words, but he seemed to grasp the intent. He lay still, his jaw tight, enduring the sting of the warm water and the lye soap without a sound. His stoicism was unnerving. She had seen hardened cowboys scream from lesser injuries. The bullet in his shoulder was a more serious problem. It was lodged deep, and she lacked the tools or the skill to extract it without doing more harm. For now, all she could do was clean the entry wound and pack it with a poultice of yarrow to staunch the bleeding and fight infection. As she worked, she saw the leather pouch still clutched in his hand. His grip had not loosened, even in his weakened state. Curiosity warred with caution. Whatever was in that pouch was important enough to die for. An hour passed, in near silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the hiss of his breath. She had managed to stitch the gash on his ribs closed with a needle and gut thread her hands surprisingly steady. She had bandaged his shoulder as best she could. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood, but the bleeding had slowed. He was resting now, his eyes closed, though she knew he was not truly asleep. She rose to brew him some willow bark tea, for the pain and fever she knew would come. As she moved about the small cabin, the reality of her situation settled in like a shroud. A Cheyenne warrior was lying on her floor. Outside, the world was filled with men who would kill him on sight and likely hang her for aiding him. She glanced at the windows, their dark panes reflecting the cozy interior, and imagined hostile eyes peering in from the blackness. When she returned with the steaming mug, his eyes were open again, watching her with an intensity that seemed to peel back her layers of self-preservation and see the core of her. He pushed himself up, slightly wincing. He spoke, his voice a low, rough rasp. The words were in his native tongue, guttural and melodic, but utterly incomprehensible to her. He gestured with his chin toward the tea, then toward his wounds, then to her. It was a question, a thank you, something more. She knelt, offering the mug. Willow bark. For the pain. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers. A spark of connection, brief and startling. He drank slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. When he finished, he set the mug down and held out the leather pouch. Ilara hesitated. He pushed it toward her again, his expression insistent. It was not a request, but an offering of trust. She took it. The leather was supple and worn, stained with his own blood. Her fingers fumbled with the sinew tie. Inside was not a sacred object or personal totem, as she might have expected. It was a folded piece of official-looking paper, an army dispatch. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was crisp, the ink a stark black. It was a set of orders written in a precise, educated hand. Her blood ran cold as she read. To Sergeant Elias Rook, from Colonel G. Blackwood, Fort Laramie, repacification of hostile elements. Sergeant Rook, you and your detachment will proceed to the rendezvous at Shadow Canyon. The Cheyenne delegation, led by the chief, Keme, believes they are meeting for a peace accord. This is a deception. You are to ensure no member of the delegation survives. They carry a copy of the original treaty agreement, which must be recovered. Make it look like an internal tribal dispute or a raid by unknown parties. No survivors, no witnesses. The discovery of their bodies will serve as the necessary provocation to launch a full-scale campaign. The land grants depend on it. Burn this dispatch after reading. Blackwood Ilara read it a second time, her mind struggling to process the cold-blooded treachery. Keme, the chief. He was a peace chief, ambushed on his way to a false parley. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a calculated conspiracy to incite a war. The land grants, he mentioned, it was all for profit. Blackwood was planning to slaughter 1,000 soldiers, settlers, and natives alike, all for a piece of paper, for a plot of land. She looked from the dispatch to the man on her floor. Keme, the peace chief. He had survived the ambush. He was the witness. And this dispatch, this was the proof. It was the viper's fang extracted from the wound. The weight of the secret she now held was immense, crushing. It was no longer just about saving one man's life. She was holding the evidence that could stop a war, the truth that could expose a monster. Keme watched her, his dark eyes knowing. He pointed to the name on the dispatch. Blackwood, he said the name, a harsh stone in his throat. He then made a motion with his hands, the universal sign for a snake in the grass. He knew. He understood what it all meant. Elara folded the paper, her hands trembling. Her simple solitary world had been shattered. She was no longer just a homesteader hiding a wounded man. She was a conspirator in a deadly game of politics and greed, a guardian of a truth so explosive it could get them both killed. The secret was a living thing now, breathing in the firelit quiet of her cabin, and its weight was enough to save a nation or to bury her. The choice she had made in the arroyo had bound her fate to his, and to the fate of everyone in this unforgiving territory. 2 days passed in a feverish whispered tension. Keme's fever rose, then broke, leaving him weak but lucid. They communicated through a fractured language of gesture sketches in the hearth ash, and a handful of English words he knew: water, horse, soldier, danger. Elara learned his name, Keme, and he learned hers. The space between them, once an ocean of cultural and racial division, had shrunk to a small, quiet stream of shared purpose. The dispatch lay hidden, wrapped in oilcloth, and tucked beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, a sleeping serpent. On the third morning, under the pale light of a hunter's moon that had yet to surrender to the dawn, the dogs began to bark. It was not their usual yapping at a passing coyote, but a frantic, aggressive clamor that signaled the approach of men. Elara's heart seized. Soldiers, she breathed, rushing to the window. 4 riders were cresting the Rye's dark silhouettes against the greying sky. The rising sun glinted off the barrels of their carbines and the brass buttons on their blue uniforms. Keme was already moving his earlier weakness, burned away by a surge of adrenaline. He pointed to the root cellar, a small dark space accessed by a trap door hidden beneath a bear-skin rug. Elara nodded, her mind racing. She helped him across the room, hissing in a low voice, "Stay silent. No matter what you hear, stay silent." He gave her a single sharp nod, his eyes blazing with a warrior's intensity before disappearing into the darkness below. She slammed the heavy wooden door, threw the rug back over it, and kicked a bit of dirt over the edges to obscure its lines. She took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothed her apron, and tried to school her features into a mask of weary neutrality. She grabbed a bucket and headed outside, determined to meet them in the open away from the cabin. The lead rider was a man whose face seemed chiseled from granite. A thick, dark mustache covered a grim slit of a mouth, and his eyes, small and cold, missed nothing. He wore the chevrons of a sergeant. Elara recognized him from a trip to Fort Laramie months ago. Sergeant Elias Rook. He was known as Colonel Blackwood's right hand, a man who carried out his commander's will with brutal efficiency. Ma'am Rook said, his voice a gravelly rumble that was more of a statement than a greeting. He reined in his horse, his men fanning out behind him, their expressions bored and contemptuous. Sergeant Elara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She clutched the bucket handle until her knuckles were white. Long ride to be making this early. Official business, Rook said, his gaze sweeping over the homestead, the tidy cabin, the fenced corral, the small barn. His eyes lingered on the creek. We're tracking a fugitive, a Cheyenne buck, part of a renegade war party that caused some trouble a few days back. Saw your smoke. Figured we'd ask if you'd seen anything unusual. The lie was so bald, so effortless, it chilled her to the bone. A renegade war party. He was describing the peace delegation he himself had slaughtered. "The only thing unusual out here is a visitor," Ilara said, forcing a small, tired smile. "It's been quiet, just me and the cattle." Rook dismounted, the jingle of his spurs a menacing sound. He walked toward her, his stride a confident swagger. He was close enough now that she could smell the stale sweat and tobacco on him. "Quiet, you say, funny. We found a trail of blood down by the creek. Looked fresh. Too much for a rabbit." Ilara's mind reeled. She had been so careful getting Keme to the cabin, but in the dark, she must have missed a spot. "One of my calves cut its leg on some wire yesterday. Had to stitch it up myself. Lost some blood before I could get to it." The lie came easily born of pure, desperate necessity. Rook's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion in their depths. "Is that so? Mind if we see the calf in the barn?" she said, her heart hammering. She prayed the story would hold. She had no injured calf. She led him toward the small barn, her back rigid. This was it. The entire deception rested on the next few moments. As they walked, one of the other soldiers called out, "Sarge, look here." He was pointing to the ground near the cabin's woodpile. It was a single dark brown spot Ilara had missed in her cleanup. A drop of Keme's blood. Rook stopped, turning to look at the spot, then back at Ilara. His gaze was hard, accusatory. "Your calf get all the way over to the woodpile, ma'am." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was caught. The game was up. But then a flash of inspiration, a memory of Samuel. "No," she said, her voice dropping, taking on a tone of weary frustration. "That's from me. Sliced my hand open, splitting firewood yesterday morning. Stupid mistake." She held up her left hand, which she had instinctively kept balled into a fist. The night she had stitched Keme's wound, the needle had slipped, piercing the flesh of her palm. The small, half-healed cut was her salvation. Rook grabbed her hand, his grip rough, and inspected the wound. It was small, but it was undeniably real, and it was in the right place. He grunted a sound of reluctant acceptance and dropped her hand. He seemed momentarily satisfied, but the suspicion didn't leave his eyes entirely. "We'll still need to check your cabin," he stated, turning back toward the house. "Standard procedure." "You have no warrant," Ilara said, her voice rising slightly. Rook turned back, a cruel smile touching his lips. "Ma'am, out here. My orders from Colonel Blackwood are the only warrant I need. Now, are you going to invite us in for some coffee while we look, or do we have to kick the door down?" Defeated, she led them inside. The small cabin felt claustrophobic with the four-armed soldiers crowding the space. They were clumsy and disrespectful, kicking at the bearskin rug, peering into her food stores, running their hands over the simple furniture. The air was thick with the threat of violence. Ilara stood by the hearth, her body a rigid pillar of feigned calm, her mind focused entirely on the floorboards beneath the rug. Every thump of a soldier's boot near it was a physical blow. Rook stood in the center of the room, his eyes scanning everything. He was a predator, sensing something was amiss but unable to pinpoint it. He picked up a clay mug from the table, the one Keme had used. He sniffed it. "You make tea from willow bark, ma'am?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. "For my aches," she replied, her throat dry. "The work gets to my bones sometimes." He set it down, his gaze lingering on her for a long moment. She met his stare, refusing to look away, praying he didn't see the terror behind her eyes. He seemed to be weighing her story, her demeanor, the evidence. The silence stretched thin and taut, ready to snap. Finally, with another grunt, he turned to the door. "All right, boys, nothing here. Let's move out. This buck is wounded. He won't have gotten far." The soldiers tramped out, leaving a trail of mud and palpable menace behind them. Rook paused at the doorway, turning back to her one last time. "You live a lonely life out here, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his tone carrying a veiled threat. "It'd be a shame if something were to happen. A fire, maybe, or a real renegade attack. You be sure to let us know if you see anything. Anything at all." He tipped his hat with a mock courtesy, and was gone. Ilara waited until the sound of their horses faded into the vastness of the prairie before she collapsed into a chair, her body racked with tremors. She had survived. They had survived. But it was a temporary victory. Rook was not convinced. He was a hunter, and he had caught the scent. He would be back. The hunter's moon had passed, but the hunt had only just begun. After the soldiers left, a profound and heavy silence descended upon the cabin once more. It was no longer the comforting quiet of solitude, but the charged stillness of a battlefield after the first skirmish. Ilara waited a long time, her ear pressed to the door, listening to the sounds of the prairie reasserting themselves. Only when she was certain Rook and his men were truly gone did she pull back the rug and lift the heavy trapdoor. Keme emerged from the darkness, his movements fluid and silent as a cat. He held his knife in his hand, and his face was a mask of grim resolve. He had heard everything. He had heard the lies, the threats, the chilling finality in Rook's voice. He looked at Ilara, and in his eyes she saw not just gratitude, but a deep, resonant respect. He nodded toward her bandaged hand, then made a gesture of a quick, sharp mind. He understood the risk she had taken, the cleverness of her lie. In that moment, the last barrier of mistrust between them dissolved, burned away by the shared threat. For the rest of the day they spoke without speaking. Keme, regaining his strength, moved about the cabin with a restless energy. He checked the load in her Winchester, tested the balance of Samuel's old hunting knife, and examined the horizon from the narrow slits of the windows. He was a caged hawk, yearning for the open sky, but knowing the hunters were waiting just outside. Ilara knew their temporary safety was an illusion. Rook's suspicion was a seed that would sprout into certainty. He would circle back. Next time he would not be so easily dissuaded. They could not stay here. The cabin, once her sanctuary, had become a trap. That evening, as firelight cast long dancing shadows on the log walls, they made their plan. Keme took a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and on a smoothed piece of buck skin, began to draw. He sketched the familiar landmarks, her homestead, the creek, the distant Bighorn Mountains. Then his hand moved with deft certainty, tracing a route through the treacherous badlands to the east. It was a path she never would have known, a series of hidden ravines, game trails and sheltered canyons that bypassed the open plains where a rider would be easily spotted. His drawing ended at a point he marked with a symbol of a fort. He looked at her and said the one word he knew she would understand: soldier. Ilara shook her head. Fort Laramie is Blackwood's fort. We can't go there. Keme's expression was intense. He shook his head vigorously, then drew another smaller fort further north. He pointed to it, then tapped his chest. He tried to convey his meaning through gestures, a man with stripes on his arm, a man who was straight, not like the snake Blackwood. He was describing an honorable officer, someone who might listen. Fort Redemption. Ilara whispered the name coming to her. It was a smaller, older outpost, commanded by a Major Sterling, a career soldier with a reputation for being firm but fair. A stark contrast to Blackwood's ruthless ambition. Sterling and Blackwood were known rivals, their philosophies on how to manage the territory clashing at every opportunity. If anyone would be willing to listen to a wild story from a lone woman and a Cheyenne chief, it might be him. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was their only one. Keme was still too weak to make the journey alone, and even at full strength he would be shot on sight long before he reached the fort's gates. She was the only one who could carry the message. She was the one who had to take the dispatch. A covenant was made in the flickering shadows of the cabin. He would provide the path. She would undertake the journey. He would stay drawing Rook's attention here if he returned, buying her the time she needed. It was a suicide mission for him, and she knew it. No, she said, her voice firm. She pointed at him, then at herself, then made a walking motion with her fingers across his map. Together. We go together. Keme protested with a series of gestures. He was wounded. He would slow her down. He was a target. Ilara was resolute. You know the way. I don't. I need you. She looked him directly in the eye, trying to pour all her conviction into her gaze. And I will not leave you to the wolves. He stared at her for a long moment, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. He saw the same unyielding spirit he had seen in the arroyo, the same steel that had faced down Sergeant Rook. He finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. They would go together. Their fates were now inextricably linked. They prepared through the night. Ilara packed a satchel with what little food she could spare, hardtack jerky, a small bag of coffee, along with her medical supplies. She filled 2 canteens. Keme, meanwhile, prepared his own kind of provisions. He took the gut thread and one of her sharpest needles, and with a focus that was both painful and fascinating to watch, began the agonizing process of digging the rifle ball from his own shoulder. He refused her help, his face a mask of sweat, sheened concentration, his only sound the occasional sharp intake of breath. When the flattened piece of lead finally dropped with a soft thud onto a cloth, he packed the wound with moss and bound it tightly with strips of leather. It was a brutal act of self-preservation that left Ilara in awe of his fortitude. She retrieved the dispatch from its hiding place and sewed it into the inner lining of her buckskin jacket. It lay against her heart, a secret that was both a shield and a target. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, they were ready. Ilara took one last look around the small cabin. It was more than a home. It was the life she had built with Samuel, a monument to their shared dreams. Leaving it felt like another kind of death. She whispered a silent goodbye to the ghosts that resided there. They slipped out into the pre-dawn chill, leading her sturdiest horse. They would ride only until the terrain became too difficult, then proceed on foot. Keme, moving with a slight limp, took the lead, his senses alive to the world around them. He was no longer a wounded man hiding in a cabin. He was a chief in his element, reading the land as she would read a book. They moved not as a white woman and a Cheyenne warrior, but as 2 survivors bound by a shared secret and a common enemy. The shadows of the early morning were long and deep, offering them cover as they moved away from the homestead and toward the jagged, unknown territory of the Devil's Backbone. Behind them, the cabin stood silent, waiting for the inevitable return of the hunter. Ahead lay a perilous journey and the faint, desperate hope of a new dawn. The land they entered was a world away from the rolling prairie surrounding Ilara's homestead. Keme led them into the badlands, a chaotic maze of steep-walled canyons, crumbling mesas, and knife-edge ridges that locals called the Devil's Backbone. It was a landscape designed to break spirits and swallow travelers whole. For them, it was their only sanctuary. The horse was a liability here. The footing was treacherous, and its trail would be a clear signpost for Rook's patrol. On the second day, after traversing a particularly narrow pass, Kem stopped. He placed a hand on the horse's neck, a gesture of quiet respect. then gave its rump a firm slap, sending it galloping back toward the open plains. Ilara watched it go with a pang of loss. It was another tie to her old life severed. Now they were truly alone, with only what they could carry on their backs. Their days became a grueling rhythm of cautious movement and enforced stillness. They traveled in the low light of dawn and dusk when the shadows were long and the heat was less oppressive. During the midday sun they would find shelter in shallow caves or beneath rocky overhangs, conserving their energy and their precious water. Keme moved with an economy of motion that belied his injuries. He taught Ilara how to walk silently, placing her feet heel to toe, how to use the wind to mask their scent, and how to read the subtle warnings of the wildlife, the sudden flight of a flock of birds, the agitated chatter of a squirrel. Her respect for him deepened with every passing hour. He was not just a warrior. He was a scholar of the natural world, a man whose knowledge was as vital as any weapon. He showed her which roots held water, which plants could be made into a pain-dulling tea that helped his shoulder, and which insects signaled the proximity of a hidden spring. Ilara, in turn, proved her own worth. Her rancher's resilience and stamina surprised him. She never complained about the thirst, the hunger, or the sharp rocks that tore at her boots and clothes. When Keme's fever briefly returned one night, she tended to him with a steady hand, forcing him to drink the cool water she had found, seeping from a rock face. Their partnership transcended the need for a common language. It was forged in shared hardship, in the silent understanding of a canteen passed between them, in the way he would point out a loose rock in her path, or the way she would take the first watch while he rested his wounded body. The journey was a constant battle against the elements and their own flagging strength. But the greater threat was the one that followed them. On the fourth day, as they lay hidden in a crevice overlooking a wide, dry wash, they saw them. Rook and his patrol. They were 4 riders moving slowly their heads, scanning the terrain. They were not moving with the urgency of a direct pursuit, but with the patient, methodical sweep of expert trackers. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Seeing them there, so real and so menacing, made the danger visceral. Rook paused, raising a spyglass to his eye, sweeping it across the very ridge where they were hiding. Ilara pressed herself flat against the rock, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against the hidden dispatch. Keme lay perfectly still beside her, his body blending into the rock and shadow, becoming part of the landscape. It felt like an eternity before Rook lowered the spyglass and nudged his horse forward, leading his men further down the wash. They had not been seen, but the close call frayed Ilara's nerves. The devil's backbone no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a closing trap. He knows, she whispered the words barely audible. He knows we're in here. Keme placed a calming hand on her arm. He then picked up a handful of pebbles. He placed one pebble apart from the others. He pointed at it, Rook. Then he swept the other pebbles into a scattered pattern. He was telling her that Rook knew they were in the Badlands, but the Badlands were vast and confusing. They still had the advantage of knowing a specific path. They pushed on their pace more urgent now. The land grew harsher, water became scarce, and their jerky and hardtack were nearly gone. Thirst was a constant companion, a fire in the back of the throat. One afternoon, caught in a sudden violent thunderstorm, they were nearly swept away by a flash flood that turned a dry canyon into a raging, muddy torrent in a matter of seconds. Keme's strength pulling her up a slick rock face just as the water surged beneath them was the only thing that saved her. They huddled together under a ledge, soaked and shivering, watching the destructive power of the water. Another reminder of how quickly this land could kill. As they neared the far side of the Badlands, Kem's wound which had been slowly healing, became inflamed. The brutal pace and lack of proper rest had taken their toll. He grew quiet, his face pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, and she could see the pain he was trying to hide with every step. Her medical supplies were exhausted. She knew if he didn't get proper care soon, the infection would take his arm or his life. The need to reach Fort Redemption became a desperate, burning imperative. On the 7th day, they stood on the final ridge of the Devil's Backbone. Below them, the land softened again into rolling plains, and in the distance, a faint smudge on the horizon, was the fort. A flag too distant to see its colors snapped in the wind. They had made it. They had crossed the wasteland. The relief that washed over Ilara was so profound it almost brought her to her knees. But as she looked at the fort, a new kind of fear began to creep in. Their harrowing journey across the wilderness was over, but they were walking out of a natural fortress and into the heart of the enemy's territory. They had survived the Devil's Backbone, but now they had to enter the Viper's Nest. Reaching the fort was one thing, entering it was another. Fort Redemption was a standard frontier outpost, a quadrangle of wooden buildings surrounded by a high stockade wall. Blue uniformed soldiers manned the walls, their rifles glinting in the afternoon sun. To these men, Keme was the enemy, a renegade to be shot on sight, and Ilara, arriving with him, would be deemed a traitor, a sympathizer, her story dismissed before it was even told. They waited in a copse of trees a mile from the fort until nightfall. Keme was fading. The infection was spreading a red network of lines, tracing a path from his shoulder toward his chest. His breathing was shallow, and he leaned heavily against a tree, his eyes glassy with fever. Time was running out. "You must go alone," he rasped the English words. A struggle. "Show. Paper." To Sterling. "I'm not leaving you," Ilara insisted, her voice fierce with desperation. "They will kill me," he said, his logic brutal and undeniable. "You live. Truth lives." He pressed a small carved piece of stone into her hand. It was a smooth, dark rock etched with the image of a hawk. "My people. North. If you live, show them this. They will know you are a friend." The finality in his voice was like a physical blow. He was preparing for his death, trying to ensure that the sacrifices made were not in vain. Tucking the hawk stone into her pocket, Ilara knew he was right. The mission was bigger than either of them. "I will come back for you," she swore, a promise that felt impossibly hollow. She left him hidden in the trees and began the long, lonely walk to the fort. As she approached the main gate, the challenge came sharp and clear. "Halt! Who goes there? Ilara Hayes!" She called out, her voice trembling slightly. "My homestead was attacked. I need to speak with Major Sterling." The gate creaked open, and she was ushered into the torch-lit parade ground. The fort was a hive of activity, a world of masculine noise and order that felt alien after a week in the silent wilderness. Soldiers stopped to stare at her disheveled appearance, her torn clothes, her scratched face, her wild, haunted eyes. She was an object of immediate suspicion. A lieutenant with a pinched, unpleasant face met her. "Major Sterling is occupied. State your business to me." "My business is for the Major's ears only." "It's a matter of territorial security," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The lieutenant sneered. "Territorial security, ma'am. You look like you've been wrestling with a badger. The Major doesn't have time for hysterical women." Before she could argue, a familiar, dreaded voice cut through the air. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in." "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it?" Ilara froze. Sergeant Rook and his men were standing by the stables, their horses lathered as if from a hard ride. He must have given up the search in the badlands and ridden here directly. A cold dread washed over her. She was trapped. Rook sauntered over, a predatory grin on his face. Fancy meeting you here? Have some trouble at that lonely little ranch of yours? Maybe those renegades finally paid you a visit. He addressed the lieutenant. This woman is a person of interest in my investigation, Lieutenant. Colonel Blackwood will want to speak with her. She's been consorting with the very savages we're meant to be fighting. The lieutenant's eyes hardened. All sympathy, however meager, vanished. Is this true, ma'am? He's lying, Ilara said, her voice rising in panic. He's the murderer. He and Blackwood. I have proof. Her outburst only confirmed their suspicions. She sounded frantic, insane. 2 soldiers grabbed her arms. Rook's grin widened. Take her to the stockade. Let her cool off. I'll send a wire to Colonel Blackwood. He'll be very interested to know we've found his little lost witness. As they dragged her away, her mind raced. Keme was dying in the woods. The dispatch was sewn into her jacket. Once Blackwood arrived, it would all be over. They would kill her, find the dispatch, and the war would begin, justified by her treachery. They shoved her into the stockade, a small, windowless wooden cell that smelled of sweat and despair. The heavy bar slammed into place, sealing her in darkness. Hope, which had been a flickering candle for days, was finally extinguished. She sank onto the rough cot, the stitched lining of her jacket, a cruel reminder of her failure. Hours passed. She had no idea if it was night or day. And then she heard a faint scratching at the door. The bar was lifted quietly. The door creaked open. A young private stood there, his face pale in the lantern light. She recognized him as one of Rook's men, one who had stayed quiet in the background at her cabin. You have to be quick, the private whispered, shoving a canteen and a piece of bread into her hands. What Rook did, what he said about that war party, it wasn't right. They were coming for peace. I heard them talking. They were carrying a white flag. The young man's conscience was their only hope. Why are you helping me? Ilara asked, her voice raspy. My family homesteaded in Ohio, he said, not meeting her eyes. My father always said you don't shoot a man coming to parley. It ain't right. Major Sterling's office is at the end of the officers' quarters. But he's not alone. Rook is with him now, telling him his side of the story. You have to get to him. With a new surge of adrenaline, Ilara slipped out of the cell. The fort was quiet, most of the soldiers asleep. The private pointed her in the right direction, before melting back into the shadows. She moved like a ghost, sticking to the darkest corners, her heart in her throat. She could see the light on in Sterling's office. Peering through the window, she saw him, a grey-haired, stern-faced man sitting behind a large desk, and standing before him, gesturing emphatically, was Sergeant Rook. She couldn't wait. She had to act now. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the door and threw it open. Both men turned, stunned. "Sergeant, what is the meaning of this?" Sterling demanded, rising to his feet. She escaped. Rook snarled his hand, going to the pistol at his hip. "I have evidence that this man, under orders from Colonel Blackwood, ambushed a Cheyenne peace delegation to start a war." Ilara announced, her voice ringing with conviction in the small room. "She's delirious," Rook shouted. "She's been helping the chief Keme escape justice." "Keme is a peace chief," Ilara retorted, tearing at the inner seam of her jacket. Her fingers were clumsy shaking, but she finally pulled the folded, blood-stained dispatch free. She threw it onto the major's desk. "This is Colonel Blackwood's signature on an order to murder those men. Read it." Major Sterling's eyes darted from Ilara's impassioned face to Rook's murderous glare, then down to the paper. He picked it up and began to read. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic ticking of a clock on the wall. As Sterling read his expression, shifted from skepticism to disbelief, and finally to cold, hard fury. He looked up, his eyes boring into Sergeant Rook. It was the look of a judge pronouncing a death sentence. Sergeant Sterling said, his voice dangerously calm, "Place your sidearm on my desk. You are under arrest for conspiracy and murder." For a second, Rook looked as if he would fight. His hand tightened on his pistol, but he saw the unyielding steel in the Major's eyes and knew the game was up. With a curse, he unbuckled his belt and slammed the weapon onto the desk. Major Sterling pulled a cord that rang a bell outside. Within seconds, 2 armed guards entered the room. "Take this man into custody. He is to speak to no one, and send a priority telegraph to the territorial governor. Immediately." As they hauled a snarling Rook away, Sterling turned to Elara. His face was grim, but his eyes held a new respect. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the night's events, "it seems you have done this territory a great service. Now tell me everything." The first rays of sunrise were painting the eastern sky as Elara, escorted by Major Sterling and a small contingent of his most trusted men, made her way back to the copse of trees where she had left Keme. A military surgeon, his bag filled with instruments and dressings, walked beside her. The weight of exhaustion was a physical burden, yet her steps were light. The truth was out. The viper had been defanged. They found Keme where she had left him, slumped against the tree, his breathing dangerously faint. He was barely conscious, but his eyes fluttered open as she knelt beside him. "The truth is told," she whispered, placing the hawkstone back into his hand. "Sterling knows. It's over." A flicker of understanding, of relief, crossed his face before his eyes slipped closed again. The surgeon went to work immediately, his assessment grim but not entirely hopeless. "The infection is severe, but he's strong. With care, he may yet live." Keme was transported back to the fort, not as a prisoner, but as a patient and a protected dignitary. He was given a private room in the infirmary, with guards posted outside, not to keep him in, but to keep Blackwood's loyalists out. The fallout from the dispatch was swift and seismic. Colonel Gideon Blackwood, summoned by a deceptively simple telegraph from Sterling, arrived at Fort Redemption 2 days later, expecting to take custody of a traitorous woman. Instead, he walked into a formal inquiry, presented with his own signed orders, and the damning testimony of the young private who had freed Elara. Stripped of his command and placed in irons, Blackwood's ambitions crumbled into dust. His conspiracy, built on greed and a lust for power, had been dismantled by the courage of one woman who chose compassion over fear. News of the averted war spread cautiously. Major Sterling, using Keme's hawk stone as a symbol of his sincerity, sent out riders to make contact with the Cheyenne. He explained the treachery of Blackwood and affirmed that the United States government, at least in his sector, wished to honor the original peace agreement. It was a fragile beginning, a tentative step back from the abyss, but it was a step nonetheless. Elara stayed at the fort for a week, watching over Keme's recovery. The fever broke, and slowly his strength began to return. Their conversations remained limited, but their understanding was profound. In the quiet of the infirmary, they were not settler and native, but 2 allies who had stared into the heart of a great darkness and survived. When he was strong enough to travel, a delegation of his own people arrived to escort him home. Before he left, he stood before Elara, no longer a wounded fugitive, but a chief, his presence regal and commanding. "My people will not forget Elara Hayes," he said, his English slow but clear. He pressed a beautifully beaded pouch into her hands. Inside was an eagle feather, the highest honor his people could bestow. "The blood you followed was a trail of war. The path you chose was a trail of peace. Our lands will remember. Ilara returned to her homestead, not as the same woman who had left it. The cabin was just as she had left it, silent and solitary. But the silence no longer felt like an absence. It felt like a peace she had earned. The vast, empty landscape no longer seemed menacing, but filled with a quiet promise. She never saw Kem again, but she would sometimes find gifts left at the edge of her property, a brace of wild turkeys, a finely tanned deer, hide a bundle of rare herbs. They were silent messages, reminders of the covenant made in shadow of the bond forged in a trial of blood and fire. The story of the rancher's wife who stopped a war became a quiet legend in the territory, a tale whispered around campfires. History books would speak of Colonel Blackwood's disgrace and Major Sterling's diplomacy, but they would never record the name of Ilara Hayes. They would never know that the fate of the territory, the lives of thousands, rested on a choice made by a lone woman as she followed a trail of blood at sunset. She sought no recognition. Her reward was the quiet dawn, the lowing of her cattle, and the knowledge that in the defining moment of her life, she had chosen not what was easy, but what was right. By sunrise, her choice had not just saved one man. It had preserved the chance for a future at dawn for two nations on the vast and unforgiving canvas of the American West. That is the story of Ilara Hayes, a name you won't find in the official records, but one that represents the countless unsung heroes who shaped our world. Her tale reminds us that history isn't just made by generals and politicians in grand halls, but by ordinary people facing extraordinary choices in the quiet, desperate moments of their lives. It's a testament to the idea that one person's courage, one act of compassion, can be enough to turn the tide, to stop a war, and to save nations from themselves. If this story of bravery, sacrifice, and the hidden currents of history moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with others who appreciate tales of the true grit of the American West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Tales that dig beneath the surface of the past to uncover the powerful human dramas that truly define us. Thank you for listening.